Okay, I think we'll go ahead and get started. Good morning and welcome to the Virginia Mediation Network keynote address. We're so happy that you have joined us, and we really sincerely hope you've been enjoying the conference, and we have yet another week of wonderful presentations for you. But we're especially glad that you chose to join us this morning. VMN is very honored to have Dean Alpaslan Ozerdem from the Jimmy and Rosalind Carter School for Peace and Conflict Resolution, formerly known as the School for Conflict Analysis and Resolution, and prior to that, ICAR, Professor of Peace and Conflict Studies. Prior to his appointment as dean in August 2019, Dr. Ozerdem was the Associate Pro-Vice Chancellor for Research at Coventry University in the UK. He specializes in conflict resolution, peace building, and post-conflict reconstruction, with over 20 years of field research experience in Afghanistan, Bosnia, Herzegovina, El Salvador, Indonesia, Kosovo, Lebanon, Liberia, Nepal, Nigeria, Philippines, Sierra Leone, Solomon Islands, Somalia, Sri Lanka, Tajikistan, and Turkey. He's undertaken numerous research projects that were funded by UK's Economic and Social Research Council, which is a faith-based conflict prevention program, the British Academy for Youth and Peace Building, United States Institute of Peace, and various European Union funding schemes. You can find his full bio if you scroll down on Whova. You will see his full bio, and I really recommend that you take a look at that. He is amazing, and we are so lucky to have him at the Carter School. And with that, I am going to turn it over to you.
Thank you very much, Pam, and what a warm welcome. Thank you so much, and good morning, everyone. It's really great to be here, and I'd like to start by thanking you all for opting for this keynote rather than enjoying such a wonderful weather out there. I think it's a glorious day, and so I'm deeply appreciative of your preferences. And so you must be hardcore ADR practitioners, and then deciding to go for a presentation on the subject rather than just being out and about and enjoying the weather. And secondly, I'd like to thank Virginia Mediation Network for inviting me to give this keynote. It's such a privilege. I'm really deeply honored. And as Pam said, I'm fairly new to the United States, and I started my dean role at the Carter School only back 2 years ago. And I'm getting to know people, and I've been dying to get to know some people from the mediation network here in Virginia. So I think it's a kind of a really great opportunity. And so I have a set of slides. That's kind of an academic deficiency, I'm afraid. I'm going to use PowerPoint. And so that's what happens when you invite an academic. And but promise there are not much kind of like writing on them. I just want to use some images. And the reason for that, I want to share some stories with you in this presentation, and the stories that coming from different parts of the globe, and stories of really hope and inspiration, as well as the critique of the way we do conflict resolution and peace building in different parts of the world. And the reason for that, sharing the stories and giving a critique of liberal peace, whether this in Afghanistan or in Bosnia or Kosovo, or whether it's in Syria, in all these places that affected by violent armed conflict is that I think the practitioners of conflict resolution and dispute resolution, we need to talk to each other more. And I think we are missing so much, opportunities by not doing this. So really, in this keynote, that's my overall goal. I want to build bridges with you. And I'm hoping that at the end of this presentation, I'm going to give you enough idea, why I claim that there's so much opportunity to do this and why that's needed. And in fact, as the Dean of the Carter School, that's one of my key priorities. So this is not just a keynote event. This is really an exercise of building bridges. But in terms of building bridges, which is the theme of this year, this fall's conference for you, I thought that it's really sort of great point of anchor for some insightful discussions in terms of what happens in the space of conflict resolution and peace building, and why we don't seem to be that successful in this. Afghanistan is probably a really good example of that, considering 20 years of the state building and peace building exercise in that country. And what we witness over the last few weeks is just like a stark reminder that something is just not going that well, right? So this is what I want to do in this presentation, just talk about, this different experiences of conflict resolution and what role and place there for dispute resolution. Okay. And as I said, I'm going to take you to different parts of the world. And the first point of journey is Bosnia-Herzegovina. I don't know whether you've been to the Balkans, which is in the eastern part of Europe. But I'm sure you remember the bloody disintegration of former Yugoslavia in mid-1990s. And Bosnia-Herzegovina was part of former Yugoslavia, and between 1992 and 1995, it experienced so much killing, displacement, destruction, human suffering, and the war in Bosnia ended with a peace agreement in Dayton, here in the United States. So that's the context that I want to take you to. But specifically, I want to look at the construction of a physical bridge. Right. So considering that we are talking about building bridges, let's talk about, building a bridge physically, reconstruction of that. And the picture you see here is the bridge in Mostar in Bosnia-Herzegovina. It's a beautiful, beautiful town, historical. And before the war, it was really kind of an attraction point for tourists. The river Neretva, you see, it's just like the most beautiful river. It changes its color, blue. I mean, the shades of blue in different seasons. And so it's really, like a context that's so unlikely for an armed conflict. But this city really experienced some of the most horrific experiences of armed conflict between 92 and 95, because it's not only divided by the river Neretva, it's also divided ethnically. So on the one side, you have the Bosniaks, they are Muslims, and on the other side, mainly Croats who are Catholics and Serbs who are Orthodox Christians. So there's kind of like a divided city environment. But that bridge, which is called Stari Most, meaning the Star of Mostar, was the kind of like the prime, example of, the symbolic value of a footbridge. It was built in 16th century by Ottoman Turks, and it always had a kind of a very special place in the hearts and minds of Mostarians, because it was a kind of a connection of these different ethnicities, different cultures. So, for example, the arrival of spring was celebrated on this bridge, in fact, every year before the war. And the brave of young Mostarians would jump in from the bridge to the river Neretva, and so much kind of like part of the culture. So, for example, when you got married, that was a kind of spot. You got your pictures taken, right? So it was really in the life of the town. But that came to really an abrupt kind of point. And in 1993, that bridge was destroyed deliberately. So it was shelled by Croat forces because what it symbolized is it was a bridge between those different cultures and ethnicities. And this is, I think, what wars do. The violence is really about disconnecting these bridges that humanity kind of creates over centuries. And that destruction really symbolized what happened in Mostar, in Bosnia-Herzegovina in general. And so that was a kind of like a makeshift bridge there for a long time. And for me, it kind of really symbolizes the way that the international community tries to help in these places, trying to provide the sort of makeshift connections. But the story is that, the physical bridge, obviously that was really important. But what that meant for the social-cultural bridges between those communities, I think that's what we want to kind of focus on. So this bridge became a focal point of reconstruction in Bosnia-Herzegovina. In a way that the international community showed, look, the wanton destruction, we can, excuse me, we can respond to this, we can do something about that. So they were really prepared to spend, huge amount of funding for its reconstruction. There were so many countries interested in this. It was really highly political. So the kind of the Turkish government said, look, it was our ancestors built this, so it's really our responsibility. And then the United States said, oh, hold on a second, I think we should rebuild this bridge because it was us really brought the conflict to an end in this country. And the Europeans said, hold on a second, this is all about like this happening in Europe. We should do this. So, everybody want to do something about that. And with a cost of overall, I think, $15 million, they rebuilt this bridge. And so much kind of like the attention to detail in the reconstruction that was quite mind-boggling, in the sense that, that was the underwater archaeology to understand how this bridge was built. The stonemasons were brought from Turkey in order to cut stones in a traditional way, and so on and so forth. I mean, I think this is probably a very best practice of how to do reconstruction in the physical sense, right? And so the actual reconstruction started in 2001 and completed in 2004. And this is the end product. You have reconstructed bridge. And that's the beautiful view of Mostar. And on a sunny day, people are mingling around and all that. So, you would expect that I would end this story with a happy ending, right? In a very Hollywood way, here it is. The international community did a great job. And I don't want to kind of dampen your mood here, and especially on a Saturday morning, but there is a but. And that but is the international community did this reconstruction in a way that there was hardly any participation of the Bosniaks and Croats and Serbs in the process. It was a really project for and by the international community, right? So that really symbolizes itself so well, because in 2004, at the opening of the reconstructed bridge, there were so many presidents, prime ministers, foreign ministers, all sorts of different dignitaries came to for the celebration. But there were hardly anybody from the local population. So, I mean, I think that is a really important lesson to draw from here. So you can actually rebuild physical bridges, but what to do for rebuilding social bridges, right, in such conflict-affected environments. So this is the kind of like the point that we want to focus in this session. What is the role of conflict resolution and dispute resolution in such conflict-affected environments? And what we can learn from each other so that, ideally, the celebration of this reconstructed bridge in 2004 would have attracted so many local people, right? They would have, come back and own the bridge again, right? So this is really the point that I want to elaborate in this presentation. Okay, now let's now move to other places. And I'm now taking you to a boat trip. And that's Titanic, right? And it was back in 1912, Titanic started this maiden journey from the UK. And I liken the whole story of Titanic to a bit peace processes. I mean, you may think that I'm mad, here, but just stay with me. There is a kind of a reason for this. And obviously, that famous scene, Kate Winslet and DiCaprio, kind of like that romantic kind of point, that kind of like the journey, the love and everything, right? This is a bit like peace processes starting after so many years of armed conflict. We tend to start with so much hope and expectation, and we assume that just there's a peace agreement, and that would be, great peace process, and that would be, happy ending at the end. But we know what happened to Titanic. Titanic hit an iceberg, and the captain of the Titanic could only see the tip of the iceberg. And, I think the claim is that he undermined the importance of that. He thought, well, it's only kind of a small iceberg. It wouldn't really harm us. We are big. It's like peace processes. When you have all these dignitaries, big people, involving in this, gives us a little bit trust in terms of, oh, well, this is going to work out. But it didn't. Titanic hit the iceberg and then, unfortunately, sank. So the iceberg of conflict, I think, should come to mind here. And I think for both ADR and conflict resolution practitioners, for us, it's not just the tip of the iceberg. We really need to understand what's happening under the water, right? And within that, in fact, the root causes of the conflict or root causes of disputes, that's the first starting point for us to understand and then address. If you don't, then your process, peace process, will come to an end fairly quickly. And that is, in fact, has been measured. So Paul Collier, Professor Collier of Oxford University, looked at all the peace processes over the last 50 years and came to the conclusion that 40% of peace processes comes to an end in the first 3 years, so that there's a return of violence. And that's up to 60% in the first 5 years, right? So all this effort of negotiations, mediation work, international intervention, you might end up with the absence of violence, but what happens afterwards is really important. So you can easily go back to the armed conflict. And that's a really huge percentage, right? And why that is happening? So let me just take you now to Oslo peace process. And this is in 1993, this famous handshake in front of the White House, Bill Clinton, president at the time, and you have Yitzhak Rabin of Prime Minister of Israel on the one side, and Yasser Arafat of the Palestinians on the other. And often when we talk about conflict resolution, we tend to describe it in that sort of famous handshake, brokering the peace deal, peace agreement. And then the expectation that the parties to the conflict could live together, resolve their problems, and that's it. But there are a number of problems with that kind of assumption. To start with, what you see in that picture, 3 men shaking hands, and that tends to be unfortunately often the case. Peace is often broken by men and middle-aged men, and I think that itself is a kind of a good indicator why this peace processes often fail, because if you are not able to bring all different segments of the society, women, youth, refugees, internally displaced people, you are not able to go down to this society and all people and all different communities, right? So that's a kind of a one issue, and there that famous handshake, fine, but this is now only the starting of that journey, and that journey. Let me describe this within the terms of Johan Galton, one of the kind of key scholars of peace studies. Galton talks about two types of peace: negative peace and positive peace. So negative peace is easy to describe. It's the absence of violent conflict, right? So this may be because of a ceasefire, a peace agreement, right? You bring the armed conflict to a halt. Okay, it's kind of gives you the opportunity of doing something about building peace, right? So that takes us to the concept of positive peace. And in fact, there is no end with positive peace, because all societies, from the United States to Scandinavian countries or UK or Africa, in all parts of the world, all countries, all societies have certain challenges based on haves or have-nots, based on race, ethnicity, religion, based on social injustices, right? So you got to address them in order to really kind of create a society that has dealt with those challenges, injustice as much as possible, so that you can start talking about positive peace. And with positive peace, I like to talk about two particular types of violence. So if you go back to the iceberg of conflict, often we deal with direct violence. That is the manifestation of what we see as conflict. And in fact, this is quite, it's not that different for ADR. And because, if you only deal with the symptoms, that's above the water. That is the kind of what's happening. And in the case of conflict resolution, that's the direct violence. But how about structural violence and cultural violence? And in fact, this is a kind of an area that really matters in our thinking about how to undertake these processes. And it really is worth talking about them a little bit more. So let's start with the structural violence. And you may find it a bit ironic that I'm using the image of the United Nations Security Council Hall to talk about structural violence. And the reason I'm doing is that because there are so many political and economic structures across the globe that create those structural types of violence in different ways. So the way, for example, in a country, the way the laws and the constitution are put together can create really deep structural violence for certain groups. So obviously in the US, there is that phenomenon of race relations and racism, and the kind of like and some of it comes from the structures that we have, and in other countries this may be different based on ethnicity or religion. But what I'm talking about here is that structural violence kills as many people the direct violence does. So, for example, structural violence causes hunger in many countries. Many people go to bed hungry, and that's because the way their state is structured, the way the global affairs are structured. So we shouldn't undermine the importance of structural violence. And that, I think, is a really important point to be borne in mind, both by conflict resolution and dispute resolution practitioners. But we also need to talk about cultural violence. So we talked about Afghanistan earlier, and the place and the role of women in Afghan society, and especially now with the arrival of the Taliban, they are likely to face so much violence culturally, in terms of their access to education, health, in terms of their access to decision making. And this is just so common in many parts of the world. This may be because of your gender, your sexuality, your age, your disability, all the differences that we carry out with us in our identity. And in some societies, you are simply marginalized because who you are. You are ostracized, you are pushed also out of the society, and you face discrimination because of that. So direct violence, yes, what the conflict resolution needs to address, that's the negative piece. But you really need to deal with the matters of structural violence and cultural violence in order to have that progress for the positive piece. And I would describe that as peace building. All the activities that we undertake in a post-conflict environment, all the things that you need to do to improve society in dealing with different types of violence. And with that, let's look at this picture. Now I'm taking you to Syria. This is Aleppo. And so if I ask you what you see in that picture, right? Take like 30 seconds, please. Look at that image. And I think, for most people, what they will see is that the physical destruction of war, right? Destroy buildings, shops, and it's a kind of a quite typical picture that we see in our TVs almost a daily basis from different parts of the world. Syria, Afghanistan, Libya, so on and so forth. But what makes the difference is that whether or not we are able to see those people amongst the ruins of these buildings. And that really just makes the whole difference in terms of the way we undertake conflict resolution. Whether or not it's about kind of state building activities of kind of rebuilding an army, a police force, reconstructing hospitals, schools, building, or we start from the lives of these war-affected people. And for me, unless you start from that point, from the lives of people, no matter what you do, it's not going to be effective and it's not going to be sustainable. And I think that's really important for both conflict resolution and ADR practitioners. And, I don't need to really say this to you, to such a distinguished audience, but that's really something that we need to underline. And what we do in that space, in reconstructing the lives of people, I think really makes the whole difference and the direction in our undertakings. So within that, I think it's really important to appreciate what we are talking about in terms of peace. And I often say this to my students, that we over-romanticize peace. We have a certain image of peace that, just sort of creates images of like, something nice, harmonious life, plenty of food, and everybody lives together, side by side. But the reality is that peace can come in different shapes and forms. Peace in some countries can be quite unjust, because of those structural and cultural violence. Peace can come in a way that, just bear in mind, that would always be spoilers of peace, because not everybody really wants peace. Let's bear in mind that, some communities, some people, some political leaders actually benefit from armed conflict. The war economy in many countries is just so significant that, bringing to an end, would also mean kind of like the end of many illicit activities like the drug trafficking, human trafficking, the arms, and the high profits, the exploitation of natural resources. So, I say to my students, why do you think that the war in Democratic Republic of Congo in Africa never seems to be coming to an end? And the answer is, it's a huge country with plenty of mines. And in times of conflict, it's much easier, much more profitable to exploit those minds than in times of peace, during which you need to pay taxes and this and that, right? So the war economy is something that we really need to bear in mind in conflict resolution. And transformation of war economy to peace economy is really important. So with that, let me just take you to the stories of some individuals here. I think it's going to give us like a little bit insight in terms of, from my perspective as a practitioner of conflict resolution and peace building, what my job is about. So you see a child soldier here, which is a kind of quite a common phenomenon in many countries. And we make lots of assumptions here with the end of war. We think that this child will simply be able to go back his family, his community, and everybody will welcome him, and and they will say, oh, well, let's forget about everything. This is going to be a wonderful life. But the truth cannot be far enough from that. It's very likely that this child won't be able to go back home because his community won't be taking him back, because as it happened in countries like Liberia and Sierra Leone in West Africa, those children are forced to commit atrocities against their own communities, so that they could have no links with their families and communities, so they won't go back home. So it's very likely that that child soldier at the age of 12, 13 would end up somewhere in an urban area, perhaps in criminality, and not really a family. And if there is a kind of a specific program to address his needs, like some sort of education, etc., that's not going to be really effective. I'm going to talk about that a little bit more later, but let's not romanticize peace for the life of this child soldier. In the kind of peace process, his life may be, I don't want to exaggerate, but as difficult as what he's going through during the war. Because, in many places, probably he would have his so-called like the fellow child soldiers. He may have some sort of structure and comradeship, all that. But in a post-conflict environment, he won't even have that. He would really be perhaps on his own, right? So this whole idea of peace building, what that means for a child soldier, we need to question. Or an Afghan refugee family. And so refugees tend to live in neighboring countries mainly. Although in the West, we have the idea that, well, we are very generous, we accept so many refugees, but the reality is that millions and millions of them actually live in neighboring countries. So in the case of Afghanistan, most of them live in Pakistan or Iran as neighboring countries. But when there's some sort of opportunity, like a peace process, when they decide to go back home, in the media, that image is often coupled with, oh, well, refugees of so country now are going back home. And that home is also romanticized. Home is kind of told as like they're going to be able to go back home, start to cultivate their land, send their children to school and all that. But the reality is that for that family, probably what they are going to discover is that their fields are full of landmines, so they cannot cultivate. Perhaps the school and clinic are destroyed, and perhaps even their house was occupied by another family, right? And perhaps when they go back to Afghanistan, they will need to be displaced internally in the country a number of times. So there is no point of romanticizing this whole idea of going back home either. It's a really challenging process, and this is why I'm saying peace is over-romanticized idea in many places. Now, the next slide is a bit graphic, and this is just like a warning. And the reason I'm using the next image, really just to understand what we are talking about, conflict resolution and peace building, and how challenging that is. So that's an image from Syria, a father holding his son, and that young boy, the only fault of his was that he was really in the wrong place at the wrong time. He was waiting in a bread queue in northern Syria, and that was shelling, and he was killed. And that father holding his son, his dead son, just imagine what he goes through and what that means, for him and for his family. And this whole idea of peace building and reconciliation, how to rebuild bridges again with other communities. What space is there for that father to even contemplate forgiving, those people, whether, they are internal or external, for what they've done and, the way his son killed. So I think when it comes to our work in conflict resolution, and there are so many psychosocial matters that we need to deal with, and they really have a huge impact in peace processes at the community level and how individuals and communities go through them. And I think with that, it creates so many disputes. I mean, that father is very likely to have many disputes in that sort of post-conflict environment if one day there's one in Syria. Now, with all that, let me just put that together in a graphic style and just say a few things here. And at this point, I'd like to make some bridges between conflict resolution and dispute resolution. So there, what you see is that kind of the armed conflict curve and the response to armed conflicts. So on the left-hand side for me, what you see is that what happens before the armed conflict. And there are so many actual stages that, before the armed conflict becomes an armed conflict. If this is about like the grazing lands in Kenya or northern Uganda about land rights, there may be some contradiction between different communities. And if those disputes are not resolved, they can turn into social tensions in much higher level. And then you may start to have some sporadic violence. And then, if they are not controlled, if they are not addressed through conflict and dispute resolution, they can turn into an armed conflict, right? So then you reach the sort of high of the highest point of your bell curve. And there, they're kind of like the highest number of people being killed, displaced, etc. And then if there are attempts to bring the conflict to a halt, peacemaking activities, creating conditions for a ceasefire and even a peace agreement, that's the period we call conflict resolution. And there that you have the activities of like the negotiations, mediation, using the good offices of the United Nations or some world leaders intervening or countries in order to bring some sort of peacemaking environment there, right? And after that, all the activities again, in the recovery and conflict transformation is about, again, the type of activities that you would have undertaken in conflict prevention before the armed conflict happens. So I think, the lower ends of this bell curve, you will see so much opportunity really to apply the understanding of dispute resolution, because that's the link, I think, the disputes and the way they turn into violent conflicts. And this is the kind of the space that I'm considering, area of great opportunities for collaboration between those two fields. So let me just explain that a little bit more. And obviously, that is about actors, and whether it's the dispute or conflict resolution, this is going to take place different stakeholders to the conflict and conflict response. So John Paul Lederach of Kroc University gives us a triangle of actors. And it's kind of a good conceptualization of who involves in such environments and different types that we have. So typically, on the level one, you have the top leadership. There are many politicians or the religious leaders or military leaders, but they tend to be much smaller in terms of numbers in comparison to, like the grassroots leaders. So many of them at the community level. And in the middle, you have the NGOs, you have the academics and religious leaders, humanitarian leaders, etc. Right? So in that triangle, again, for the peace process to be sustainable, if we don't end up with that percentage of 40% in the first 3 years, the area that we need to focus on, obviously at the bottom, at the grassroots level, how to sustain that peace process. But that is vertical kind of peace building activities, different communities, individuals, and how to resolve and disputes and conflicts amongst them. But also these actors vertically, whether they are at the top level, middle, or the grassroots, there will be so much disputes between them. Again, this may be a helpful paradigm for us to understand, the opportunities of bridging dispute and conflict resolution, in terms of actor perspective, who they are, and the way they work in such environments. And that's kind of like the easy part of this story in a way. But the difficult part is when you have so many different actors, excuse the kind of the analogy here, but it's really like herding cats, because every actor here that we talk about would have their own agendas, priorities, and the way they would intervene in that particular context would be different. And so the coordination and cooperation amongst them becomes so fundamental. So if you don't want that whole thing experience turning like herding cats, and trust me, you can never do that. And cat owners know this so well, you cannot do this. And we really need to address this issue, because unless you do that, then you end up with some sort of environment that, everybody does their own bits, and, you end up nothing. And, you can actually take this analogy to even to mediation framework. So I'm sure in the mediation context in Virginia and in the United States, there are so many different actors, right? So some of us, work in the legal context, some of more in higher education, some of it's HR, health, education, right? And we all have kind of different take on ADR, the way we practice ADR differently, unless it's coordinated. And that's why I really admire the work of Virginia Mediation Network. It creates the kind of opportunities of coordination. And similarly, I think in post-conflict environments, that's what we need to do. So, I think the point I'm making here is that, what are the ways of working together? And again, my question, how can the ADR and conflict resolution practitioners work together, right? I think, and not having that sort of experience of not being able to herd the cats. Now, I'll just give you a couple of examples, and then I will start to wrap up this presentation. So this image, those who've been to UN headquarters in New York must have seen it, and it really symbolizes the silencing of weapons. That symbolizes end of armed conflicts. And obviously United Nations, as a post-Second World War security structure, its main responsibility is peace and security. And this is a really point that, point of focus for them. And in many conflict-affected countries, that's something that I studied quite extensively, is the disarmament, demobilization, and reintegration of ex-combatants, like that child soldier you saw earlier. But within that, let's take back the story of that child soldier and what the reintegration means for him, right? And within that, we already started that story saying that, well, actually, it's very like that he won't be welcomed by his family. And in fact, the challenges for a girl soldier would have been a lot more, because then that was, a myriad of socio-cultural issues, because, the girl child soldiers, when they go back to their communities, it's very likely that they would be ostracized. And in fact, many girl child soldiers won't even accept that they were part of the fighting, because, the society would treat them differently, right? And they would often navigate the stories that they were kidnapped during the war, and then they kind of miraculously they found their way back to community, etc. Because they know that socioculturally they would experience so much violence, in the post-conflict environment, and that reintegration process, rebuilding bridges between ex-combatants and their receiving communities would mean that a kind of a wide range of disputes. This may be social, cultural, economic, and so again, this may be just a simple, it's a peace building activity of DDR, disarmament, demobilization, and reintegration. But the reality is that how to rebuild bridges between those individuals and their communities, how to deal with those disputes amongst them, I think is really significant. So that's one example that I want to share with you. The second one is this story of reconciliation, really. So as Pam said, that before the US, I was at the University of Coventry in the UK. And those who've been to UK, like most Americans do, when you travel from London to Edinburgh, and when you stop York on the way, Coventry is something between London and Birmingham, right? And it's right in the middle of the country. And the story of Coventry is really interesting because during the Second World War, it was bombed by Germans, because it was a city that was in the middle of all sorts of like the factories producing arms and weapons. So and Germans thought that it was a legitimate target. And until being bombed, it was a beautiful medieval city, and the experience of that bombing, and in fact the old cathedral, which you see the ruins of it in this picture, the day after the Blitz, the provost of the Coventry Cathedral went there, and there was a group of local people gathered there, really upset and angry, and they had so much resentment, and but he said, look, from this point onwards, we are not going to go for revenge, but we are going to go for reconciliation. And he prayed by saying that, God, forgive us all, not Germans for what they did, because he really recognized that, reconciliation is about bringing all parties together. So, with that kind of mission, Coventry became a really interesting city after the Second World War, and even during the Cold War years, it was a kind of a pioneer city that went and built bridges with the cities of Eastern Bloc, Dresden, Warsaw, Belgrade, twinning with them, trying to create partnerships. And that's the bridge of reconciliation statue in the old cathedral ruins that you see here. And why I'm sharing this story with you? I'm sharing this story because Coventry could only do this because it had the objective of dealing with the past, dealing with the armed conflict and its destruction, but also creating opportunities of dealing with disputes in the post-conflict environment. And I think, there is never an end for negotiations and mediation in post-conflict environments. If you stop doing that, then you stay at the negative peace, and you have never chance to move to positive peace. And I think this is why it's so important. So let me just conclude with few ideas that we can actually use in our discussions. Now, I think you noticed that in this presentation, I keep addressing this so-called binary between conflict and dispute resolution. That's really interesting in a way, because those two fields seem to have kind of grown in their own ways, with hardly any significant connection points, bridges between them. And so the idea that the conflict resolution deal with the violence, with violent conflicts, and dispute resolution more between individuals and within workplace or sometimes, but community, but not much. But I find that whole binary so artificial. I think there is so much that those two fields could learn from each other, because at the end of the day, more or less, the tools and processes we use are same. And probably contexts are different, the challenges are different, but why we are not talking to each other more often? Why is the first time that, being a scholar of peace building for 25 years, this is really kind of like the first time that I'm addressing, practitioners of ADR. I mean, why? I mean, this is really the question I keep asking myself. Why I haven't talked to ADR practitioners before? And thanks to Pam giving me this opportunity that I'm doing right now. I mean, so my point here is that really that binary is so artificial. We got to move beyond that. We really need to try to understand what we do, and we learn from each other. And the second point I made in this presentation is that, well, whether it's the conflict management, that is all the activities to control conflict, resolution, remember our curve, all the activities in conflict prevention and peace building, and long-term conflict transformation. I think, as my examples and illustrations show, there is so much space for ADR practitioners, to be honest, in such environments. So I like to see a lot more ADR practitioners working in conflict-affected environments, because such skills would be so invaluable in such environments. Because working with individuals, mediating disputes amongst them, really in that bell curve, the left-hand side, conflict prevention, that's the cheapest way of responding conflict. Because once there's an armed conflict, the destruction, killing, and the displacement, it becomes so heavy toll for the society. If we are able to do this, before that it becomes a violent conflict, it's no-brainer, isn't it? We can do so much in that space. But I think at the same time, I reckon that this cooperation, building bridge between conflict and dispute resolution, can give different opportunities of understanding about dispute resolution. Now, I don't want to make assumptions here, and I don't want to, and I don't want to be in the wrong here by saying that, but I wonder how much of the structural violence and cultural violence we talk about really come into the picture when we practice dispute resolution. Getting to yes is fine, but if we don't understand social justice matters, whether it is in the UK, US, France, or Afghanistan, really, but that dispute resolution in such environments, without understanding the social injustices, I think the whole thing would be a futile exercise. Like, our experience with conflict resolution. Peacemaking is fine, but without peace building, you are going to end up with that 40% of failure, right? So, what happens after dispute resolution? How to address those root causes of disputes? And what is the meaning of the structural and cultural violence that we experience in all societies in dispute resolution? I think it's a question to ask. So I'm hoping that that may be a point of discussion. And finally, this is almost like a self-critique, being a scholar of conflict resolution, why we don't do more of like the education and training of the future peace builders and dispute resolution practitioners under the same roof? Why they tend to take their courses in different institutions of specialization? And that has been one of my primary goals since I started as Dean of the Carter School. And in fact, this fall, we just launched a dispute resolution graduate certificate program. And with that very much goal in mind. So dispute resolution with the perspective of social justice and what that means in contemporary world, right? So I like to see more of this, and I like to see really kind of like dispute and conflict resolution being taught and undertaken, in a much more connected way. So this is really my final slide, just to bring everything together. So as I said, every cat has its own way of, eating milk. So the Carter School approach, I think we need to mention here. And for me, I think what matters here is that I think analysis before resolution. We really need to understand the root causes, the iceberg of conflict, and what's happening. What we are not able to see. The direct violence, we see the ramifications and the consequences, but what we are not see is what's underwater. And the analysis is really important, and both for the dispute and conflict resolution. And I think the second point that I think is really important is the importance of the nexus between peace and justice. I think without justice, peace is not peace as far as I'm concerned. It's only perhaps negative peace. I'm not undermining importance of negative peace here, but I think justice element dealing with the structural and cultural violence is really important. And I think this would have the strong resonation with dispute resolution issues. I think participation, as I talk about quite a bit in this presentation, from the beginning to end, needs assessment to evaluation, how to engage those people affected by conflict really is important. So this is not going to be then a top-down external intervention. This is about the process that, those objects of the process are also the drivers of the process. And I think, as we know, as the practitioners of dispute and conflict resolution, it's a very difficult task to achieve, but it's also really important for the sustainability of peace. And finally, this is the very final point, and that is the importance of innovation and being able to work with other disciplines, because our discipline is really kind of changing all the time. There are all sorts of different challenges. We cannot do, for example, conflict resolution with the understanding of what happened during the Cold War years or in the post-1990s, and or even now in the post-9/11 context with the environments of Iraq, Afghanistan, Libya. From the practitioner of conflict resolution and peace building, I know that some of the approaches and understanding we did years ago have become quite defunct. For example, with so many non-state armed groups. In Syria, you had 1,000 or more of them. What are you going to do, when it comes to conflict resolution? How to engage them in the process? So we need to be innovative all the time. And also we need to be multidisciplinary. And the point with the conflict resolution, I think it's time that we work with other disciplines, like engineers, like those who generate technology. So one of the new initiatives we had at the Carter School is that we established a peace engineering lab, really just to understand the role of technology in conflict prevention and peace building. And so with that, I think in this keynote, what I try to achieve is to show you with show you the possible linkages between ADR and conflict resolution. I hope I generate enough question marks in your mind, and I think it's really important, and it's something that we've got to do together. And I'm hoping that now with the Q&A session, we can elaborate some of these issues further. So thank you so much for your attention, and let's move to the next section, the Q&A. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And I just want to read some of the comments, because I don't know, you probably haven't had a chance to see them. Wonderful presentation. Thank you so much. Yes, excellent, innovative way to look at peace building. Agree, can't have justice without acknowledgement and understanding the social injustices that have caused the conflicts. Again, great presentation, thanks. I agree with all the comments regarding peace and justice. I appreciate you sharing in reference to various disciplines working together, and this has been wonderful. And just to kind of build on what you have said, Dean, I I am so grateful for the foundation that I got in analyzing conflicts. It always helps me in a mediation, even if I'm doing a consumer mediation or a family mediation, knowing how to dive a little bit deeper underneath the water, because I see the iceberg, but what is driving this? What is causing this? And the one thing that is really great is that the Carter School formed a partnership with NAFCM, which is the National Association of Conflict, Resolution.
Community mediation.
Thank you. Thank you, Christine. And so they have got a special certificate that's 15 hours. There's a bit of a cut in the rate if you belong to NAFCM. And I highly encourage everyone to take that 15 hours. I think it will take your mediation to another level. And I think it will also help you understand at a deeper level what is going on in the world, that we very much have a role in this. And I'll just give you, for instance, so this week I've had to work on some conflicts with people interpersonally. I just got back from New York last night addressing a group about the Algerian conflict, and it really is not so hard once you understand to move between the two venues, because you're right, Dean, you use all the same tools, but there are just some nuances. So I really want to invite you to look at that 15-hour certificate program. I believe a lot of it is presented virtually, so it would be very easy for everyone to participate in that. Are there any questions?
So, by the way, that was the commercial time for the Carter School. Thank you so much for that.
And stuff. Well, it's just hard. I mean, it's been meaningful to me, and I've watched it grow exponentially. When I first started with the Carter School, and it was then called ICAR in 2002, we were in townhouses. And so some of the classes were held in the kitchen. So, it's just, so it's great. And now we have a beautiful convention center or conference center in Mason Neck called Point of View.
Pam, it looks like Andrea has a question.
Yes, Andrea.
Thank you. Hello, thank you so much for your presentation. I don't know if I have a question or question/comment, but as a certified mediator who, works with families going through conflict, they come to us and they're ready often to engage in that process. And when I think of the bigger, broader concepts that you're talking about, which are so important, at times, I think for many of us, it feels a bit overwhelming because we don't always know who to reach out to, who the players are that really would make an impact at the community level. And so intellectually, everything makes so much sense. And then there is this paralysis of, okay, but what is my next step? And so I don't know if you would have any words regarding what would be either a way to unlock this paralysis or a first step toward really feeling a little bit more not motivated, but empowered to engage at a broader community level. Thank you.
Thank you, Andrea. I think that's, I'm not going to pretend that that's going to be easy. And that's because of the gap that we have between dispute and conflict resolution today. But I really want to kind of see in a few years' time, that gap would be bridged a lot more. Mm-hmm. And so any dispute resolution practitioners, certified mediators, if they would like to work at more community level, and look, I'm not saying in a lighthearted way. I'm really serious when I say this. as the ADR practitioners, you would be amazingly valuable in kind of contexts as I work. Because, and believe me or not, I mean, I worked in a number of countries across the world. There are not many people of conflict resolution, or what I would say, people working in the United Nations or international NGOs like Oxfam or the Save the Children, so on and so forth. These are big operations, and they provide assistance to conflict-affected people, try to build peace and all that. But they don't necessarily have the skills of negotiation and mediation. They tend to do the job almost like, because they have the particular expertise in delivery of humanitarian assistance, or they know how to treat, sick people, or they can actually sort of create socioeconomic development programs. But skill set of negotiation and mediation, what you have would be so wonderful in such environments, because constantly in such environments, you are dealing with many disputes between different organizations, disputes with the former combatants and community, disputes between government and NGOs, right? So if any of you would prefer to work not in Northern Virginia, but somewhere like, I don't know, Libya or Iraq or Afghanistan, your jumping point wouldn't be that painful, to be honest. And because you already have the skill set. What you need, as Pamela said, is just like additional skill set of like analyzing violent conflict, operating in such environments, right? So our dispute resolution program could be a good point, because it's really kind of designed for that purpose, giving the practitioners of mediation the kind of the opportunity of understanding the community level conflict, armed conflict, so that they can actually sort of start to see that wider, greater picture. But there are other programs that we have, for example, a graduate certificate program that's 15 credits for the conflict analysis and resolution. So Andrea, if you say, well, look, I'm a certified practitioner, but I want to learn the conflict analysis and resolution in more detail, that may be your opportunity, right? And that's 15 credit, and it's mainly online, so you don't need to stop working as a mediator, right? Because at the end of the day, that's the problem, isn't it? We all have families, we all need to, make a living, and we cannot stop, working in order to study, right? That's the reality. But, these programs can give you opportunity like that. And then once you've done that, you can have internship, you can have work with some of these organizations. I mean, and they all need to be in those countries full time. You can be employed as consultants working in certain, areas for specific role and goals. So what I'm saying here basically is that, ladies and gentlemen, you could be so pivotal in resolving conflicts, not only in your communities here in Northern Virginia, but across the world, if you want to apply those skills in such places. So do consider that as an opportunity, because what you have as the skill set are really important for peace building environments.
Very good.
Thank you so much.
Sure, thank you. Someone had asked, what organizations would you contact in the UK to be involved in this kind of work?
In the UK? Depending on, if you are planning to do mediation work at the more family, individual, and the workplace, I'll tell you something. The US is quite a different place from the rest of the world. Having studied and lived in the UK for a long time, it only came to my attention what a widespread network of mediators that could be when I arrived in this country. In many countries, the mediation work is not that common, but I think it should. Also, I think, I don't know who asked the question, if you are planning to go to UK, and you can actually initiate your own programs there. And because it's a kind of like an emerging field in many places, and it's not really pronounced in the way it is in this country. In the US, it's just so well developed, the whole dispute resolution ADR field. But in other countries, that's not the reality. So when you go to UK, I'm afraid there won't be many organizations that define what they do as like the ADR work, but they do. Exactly the same thing. They do this in HR, in education, in health, in all frontline sectors, etc. But you won't find that sort of like the natural connection point immediately in the UK. But there's opportunity for you to actually grow it with more pronounced way, and that would be my suggestion.
Mediators Beyond Borders International also is an excellent way to get involved. And
thank you. I forgot that. Sorry.
I can't remember. It's been maybe about 10, 12 years ago. The UN had mandated that they wanted all the court systems in Europe to implement a program like we have in the courts. And they really, really have dragged their feet. They were supposed to do it, what was it, by 2019, 2016 or 2019 come to mind. And maybe the first date was 2016 and then 2019. And many of them are still dragging their feet. So there is some opportunity for us to basically teach them and that kind of thing. The Carter School has a campus in Malta, and
Malta.
Yes, and I would love to go over there and implement what I'm doing here with the students here, because it has been quite a boon for our students in terms of getting jobs, and some of the places they are winding up. It's just amazing, but it may be a way to step in over there through the university. I've got one comment. Carter has a wonderful program. I earned my master's there. Great, Julie. And began the graduate certificate program, which got me hooked. So you started the certificate program and then went to a full master's. Great, that is fantastic. It assists in her capacity to mediate and assist her in conflict resolution. She thought, Dean, you did a wonderful presentation.
Thank you.
And I traveled to Bosnia and Herzegovina and learned about the challenges there and that kind of thing. So it's just amazing how our skills intersect. And I'll just give you one real quick story. When I was doing my doctoral work, I wound up in a village in South Ecuador called Vilcabamba. And what was happening was there was a fountain in the middle of a city that had been built by the indigenous area. It was an area called a blue area. So most of the people lived to be over 100. And the fountain was 200 years old. There was a group of American expats that had moved in there because of the water. And they decided that they wanted to tear the fountain down and put a statue of their cult leader there. And the village was very concerned about being disrespectful, and they didn't want to do that, but they didn't know how to deal with this group of American expats. I have a lot of experience in local governance, and so I was able to use the skills that I have learned alongside you guys and from Mason and from Nova to figure out how to bridge that. And so that's something you might can experience as you're traveling around. And it's just so gratifying. I would say the average conflict resolver, we just want to help. We just want to help our fellow humans. And the program at the Carter School, the certificate will just give you just a little more information that I think you will find invaluable. There's also, Donna posted, the Society of Mediators in London are trying to initiate programs in conjunction with King's College. So, you know, that's just one more avenue and that kind of thing. And I'm sorry, I could go on and on about the higher education opportunities. So I'll try to get off my soapbox. Is there any other questions or comments?
Could I ask a question?
Sure.
And I'm really curious about this, and it is around the whole issue of structural violence, the problems related to that. How much of structural violence thinking informs your work as mediators? You know, and how much of that really gives you the kind of the framework when you deal with those disputes between individuals or in the family context? Because, you know, resolving conflict, say between two colleagues, you know, in my school, we really need to understand, you know, who they are, where they come from in terms of their backgrounds, and all the kind of social injustice that they might be facing. So that's my kind of starting point. But I just want to kind of like have an understanding of, from your day-to-day practice, how much of the structural violence concept, idea, informs what you do? And is that something that you consider? Are you encouraged to consider or not? And can we just have a little discussion on that? I would be really happy, you know, grateful to hear your experience on that.
Does anyone want to weigh in?
I'm happy to.
Great.
Start. So when I do restorative mediation sessions, I think that this concept is, you know, high on my mind, trying to understand what circumstances and experiences might have led an individual to make choices, and to put individuals together where the victim and offender can really explain where they're coming from, not as an excuse, but just an explanation, can be very transformative. So in those situations, very high on my mind. On a family mediation case, I would say that it's on my mind always as a potential factor, but the clients bring it to the table. If they're saying something that might explain their feelings, their frustrations, and what has led them to, you know, make the choices they did, then yes, I'll bring it to the table. Simply because of the structure of how a lot of us run our mediation sessions in a facilitative approach, when I want to bring that possibility up, if it hasn't been brought up at some level by the parties. But it's absolutely, I would say, in a lot of our minds, because I know a lot of people here, we understand that that is a great possible explanation for why people have made the decision that they have, and that there's great pain, a feeling of you know, unfairness, helplessness, hopelessness in their world because of the injustices that they have experienced. That's my, of course, my perspective.
Anyone else? That's great, Andrea. Anyone else ever thought about the concept of structural violence
Or cultural
or
violence.
cultural violence? Feel free to unmute and ask.
Hi, Pam. I can add. This is Christine.
Okay.
And through our, hi, Dean Ozerdem. In our Virginia Trust Network program, which is a branch of the Mediators Beyond Borders Trust Network program, we are looking at more of those structural issues. And we do that through the prevention piece. There's a monitoring piece where you're monitoring what's happening, trying to kind of assess the situation. The second piece then is a prevention piece. And that's where we could step in and help communities or individuals discuss really what is going on here, what needs to happen to transform this conflict. And then the last piece then is when things are just happening in the moment, where we might step in. So I think what you're talking about, Dean, is that more of that second piece, that prevention piece. So through that Virginia Trust Network program, that's where we're trying to really look at those issues of social justice, because I completely agree with you. If there's no justice, there's no peace. And we see that over and over again. So that's where we want the bulk of our work to be in that program, is in that prevention piece. And anybody's willing, invited to join that Virginia Trust Network program. Just get with me and I will let you know how we can get you involved in that.
We have one comment. Doug mediates workplace conflicts for civilian employees in a military setting. There's a cultural gap between expectations of military supervisors over civilian personnel. And these concepts are definitely play a part in understanding perspectives. So I would say that. And a bit when we go into our membership meeting, the Dean, Christine, and I are involved in a new initiative, kind of a working group. I don't know that we've decided what we're going to call ourselves yet, but we'll be addressing a lot of the things that we're talking about and trying to create a bridge between dispute and conflict resolution. Very excited about it, so stay tuned. Anyone else have any comments, questions for the Dean?
Pam, I'll just quickly add too that within our court systems, we're also seeing some initiatives like drug court. And so, if people come and they are in trouble for their use of or possession of drugs, there's a recognition that there's probably also some other issues that people could need some help with. I mean, why are they selling drugs in the first place? Maybe it's because they don't have an adequate income. So I think there even are within sometimes police and the courts, and these institutions don't necessarily move very quickly, but I think there's a recognition that if we don't start addressing some of these underlying issues for people, then we're just chopping off that little tip of the iceberg and the rest of it is still there.
Right. One thing I'll add to that, recently received a question actually from the state, asking us about engaging in mediation between landlords and tenants because of the eviction and that kind of thing. And I think the whole structural violence will also come into that as well. So that's something that we're going to be also trying to see if we can help with as well. So just stay tuned. We're doing a lot. Anyone else? All right. Well, we have, I think we've had a great presentation. Thank you so much, Dean, for taking your Saturday morning and speaking to us. It was fantastic. I really appreciate it. Great to see you again. And with that, if there's no other comments by anyone, we're going to take a 15-minute break before we go into our annual meeting, our membership meeting.
And I think as a final word, Pam, let me just thank you all for being with me and being very patient with me. And because, as I said, I mean, I'm a man of mission here, and I really want to change this gap. I want to bridge the gap between dispute and conflict resolution, and hopefully we are going to make a good progress with this, because I do think that we have a responsibility for our students. In our curriculum, for example, at the Carter School, I like to give a lot more on negotiation and mediation, for example, than what we have. We already have a wide range of courses, but I think that to prepare them as the future mediators, we need to do more. But similarly, I like the Qatar School to be a welcoming place for practicing mediators. So the conference organizers, please feel free to share my contact details with participants. And so if you have any questions about how to do that next step, like Andrea asked, I would be more than happy to hear from you, and then we can take it from there. And do think about our new program in dispute resolution with that social justice perspective. And so that would be really great. And so I wish you all a very good conference. I think you have another week of conference continuing, and thanks very much, Pam and the Virginia Mediation Network, for inviting me to be part of this wonderful event. Much appreciated. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much for coming. Really appreciate it very much. And stuff. All right. Well, with that,